Okay, let's unpack this. We've all seen how, big global events demand a leader's attention. But what happens when something deeply personal, an assassination even, hits close to home, connects right to a leader's own sense of vulnerability? Today, we're doing a deep dive into exactly that. President Donald Trump's really powerful and very personal reaction to the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. We're drawing on insights from Maggie Haberman, the CNN commentator and New York Times White House correspondent. She shared her reporting on CNN's The Arena with Casey Hunt. Our goal here is to understand how just one single awful incident can really redefine priorities right at the top.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How that lens of personal experience can just so intensely filter the way a leader sees broader events. When something hits that close, it really can reshape, well, almost everything. We'll be exploring how this specific tragedy, as Haberman reported it, became such a central, almost consuming concern for Trumpworld, how it really altered the president's thinking, his priorities, right when the administration was already juggling so much. It really shows that human element, even in the presidency.
Exactly. And Haberman didn't just mention it in passing. She really stressed how deeply unsettling, how genuinely shaking this was for the whole White House operation, especially, yeah, for the president himself. You'd think, okay, the White House is always juggling a million things, global issues, domestic crises, and they are. But Haberman says Kirk's death weighed incredibly heavily, so much so it was apparently still a dominant concern even while he was on a major diplomatic trip, to the UK no less. And here's a really crucial piece that kind of ramps up the impact. Trump and several high-level officials in his administration, they actually knew Charlie Kirk personally, had direct connections.
Right.
So this wasn't just some abstract news item. It felt like a personal loss within that inner circle.
And that personal connection, that's absolutely key to understanding the reaction, isn't it? It just transforms it from an abstract political event into something immediate, visceral, a real crisis. Haberman's reporting really suggests that for Trumpworld, this wasn't just about PR or strategy. It sparked a real sense of, well, grief and alarm. And the fact, as you said, that it preoccupied him even on a foreign trip, that just underscores how deeply it got under his skin, how it permeated his focus.
Yeah, potentially pulling attention away from, the usual diplomatic stuff.
Exactly. This isn't just about policy. It's about the emotional landscape, the psychology of leadership when faced with what feels like a very personal danger.
That's a really powerful way to put it. It moves it beyond just politics into that human experience of loss and, maybe more importantly, perceived threat. And Haberman's reporting zeroes in on this. Trump apparently saw Kirk's killing not just as, a terrible isolated thing, but he viewed it directly through the prism of ongoing threats to his own life, his own safety. She reports he specifically linked Kirk's death to what he saw as two previous assassination attempts against him. And she even notes one was a near miss just last year. That's quite a detail, isn't it?
It's chilling.
Yeah.
And it totally reframes how he must have processed Kirk's death.
Right.
When a leader sees that kind of direct line between something happening out there and threats to their own existence, it fundamentally changes their risk calculation. It's not just an intellectual assessment of security reports anymore. It becomes deeply emotional, psychological.
Right.
Haberman's reporting makes it sound like, for Trump, Kirk's assassination wasn't just a political tragedy, it was like a flashing red light, a stark reminder of the danger he felt he was in. And that personal connection, that linking of events, it just dramatically drives this intense focus on his own security. And, by extension, the whole security setup around him, his team, the administration, it bumps personal protection way up the priority list, maybe influencing decisions way beyond just standard security protocols.
So, okay, you have this intense personal lens, this feeling of threat and vulnerability. Haberman also reports on how Trump then framed the whole issue of political violence more broadly. He apparently attributed it primarily, almost consistently, to the left, which is a specific framing, especially when you consider other reported incidents of political violence, right? Like the attack on Speaker Pelosi's husband or things involving state lawmakers from different parties.
Yeah, and that's where the reporting gets particularly insightful. When a leader feels personally targeted, their interpretation of where that violence comes from, what it looks like, it can become very specific. And often it aligns pretty closely with their existing political narrative. Haberman's observations suggest this wasn't necessarily like a balanced, objective survey of all political violence happening. Instead, it seems more like a reflection of the specific threats the president perceived against himself and his interpretation of those threats. And that interpretation then becomes central to Trumpworld's concern, their strategy.
So the focus sharpens on validating that sense of personal danger.
It seems that way. Less about a broad assessment, maybe more about confirming the perceived personal vulnerability. And that can really shape the public conversation, can't it? Because the leader's platform just amplifies certain narratives way more than others. It influences what gets talked about, what gets prioritized, maybe even how security itself is discussed or implemented.
That's a critical point. How personal experience doesn't just shape one person's reaction, but potentially the whole public discussion around something like political violence. So thinking about that, let's talk broader implications. Haberman's reporting suggests Kirk's murder became this central concern for Trumpworld. If the president's focus was drawn so sharply to personal security, to this specific framing of violence, how might that have, recalibrated things across the board in the White House? I mean, like you said, they were dealing with other huge political and diplomatic challenges at the same time.
Right. And that's where you see the potential for really profound ripple effects. Haberman's account implies this intense personal focus on security wasn't just one more thing on the list. It likely colored discussions, redirected resources. When the leader's top personal concern shifts so dramatically, that tends to trickle down. It affects staff priorities, advisor focus. It can even subtly change the tone of diplomatic talks or how domestic policy issues are debated. It sounds less like just adding an item to the agenda and more like this incident fundamentally reoriented what felt most urgent, what demanded the president's immediate time and energy.
A kind of strategic pivot, maybe, driven by this very personal connection and his own sense of being under threat.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Which would naturally have real consequences for how other major challenges were tackled, or maybe even just put on the back burner for a bit.
Absolutely. That phrase shaped the president's thinking and priorities at a time when his administration is also confronting other major political and diplomatic challenges that really hits home. It just shows that unique weight of leadership, doesn't it? Where personal trauma can intersect with these huge national and global duties in ways we don't always see. But they have a profound impact. Haberman's reporting gives us this rare look inside that dynamic. It shows how deeply one tragedy can seep into the highest levels of government, reshaping not just one person's focus, but maybe the whole rhythm and direction of an administration.
Indeed. And it really forces us to think about that tricky balance leaders have to strike between their own personal experiences, their fears, and the objective demands of the job. Because those perceived threats, however personal they feel, carry enormous public weight when they start influencing how national issues like political violence are framed or how government resources get allocated. This kind of reporting helps us appreciate just how complex decision-making is at that level, where subjective feelings, subjective fears can become really powerful drivers affecting an entire nation's priorities.
So what does this all mean for you listening in? We've really tried to unpack Maggie Haberman's reporting on President Trump's reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination. We saw how this terrible event, which had these personal ties for Trump and his team, became deeply unsettling for the White House. And this deep dive showed how the president seemed to view it not in isolation, but directly through the lens of threats against him personally, including that really stark detail about the near-miss assassination attempt reported last year.
Yeah, and if you connect that to the bigger picture, it really highlights how profoundly someone's personal experiences, their perceived vulnerabilities, can shape their priorities as a leader, how it can influence their public statements, the very narrative they build around major events. Haberman's reporting gives us this framework, right, to understand how Trump's intense focus on security and his specific way of attributing political violence, even with other examples out there, became such a central driving force for him. How it shaped his thinking and the administration's responses, even while dealing with all those other big political and diplomatic things.
It's definitely a powerful reminder of just how complex these situations are and how different people, especially people in positions of immense power, interpret things, react to things based on their own unique viewpoint and sense of threat. The sources really convey the sheer weight this incident seemed to place on the president and his inner circle. It shows how deeply personal the job of leadership can become. We hope this deep dive gave you maybe a clearer sense of this particular, very human side of political leadership and the kind of ripple effects these profoundly personal events can trigger.
And it leaves us with a question, really, for you to think about as you process all this. How do a leader's very personal experiences with threats, perceived or real, and how they interpret those threats? How does that ultimately affect their decision-making? And, maybe just as importantly, how does it shape the national conversation, especially when those personal perceptions might not line up neatly with broader societal patterns of violence? Definitely something to mull over as you continue to watch how leaders navigate this incredibly complex and often unpredictable world we're in.